Yes, we are live now. Um, Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for this third session in the series. Is just culture desirable for learning? There are some familiar faces. I will because we have one new face here, so it'd be good to get a very quick round of introductions. So, Nico, since you are the new one on this in this series, and there's a slight surprise also. It was supposed to be Steve Shorrock, but Steve is attending the session on the 7th of April, and Nikos has kindly accepted to do this one. So I'm glad you did that, Nikos. Thank you. Nikos, would you like to introduce yourself? And then we will ask Donna and then RJ to introduce themselves before we kick off.
Sure. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I have been a professional seaman all my adult life and a little bit before. I have moved from the lower ranks until the highest of these of a captain on ships. The last 15, 16 years, more or less, I'm in command of ships. And have been really trying to deeply understand the concept of safety, considering that in a role like mine, a truly responsible one, I have to take care of that seriously. In due time, I realized that some things work and some things don't, and I started to question why things don't work or if whatever we are tutored is correct. And that is more or less the reason that I'm here. I've been driven personally and throughout our mutual discussions, but not only, to find out how we can really improve things, or if what we are doing doesn't work and maybe does not produce the desired result. So this is it. I'm based in Greece, and apparently I'm not at sea right now. Thank you.
Yes, we can see that you're not moving, so we assume that you're not at sea. Thank you, Nikos. Hello, Donna. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I would. Thank you very much, Nippin, also for the introduction and for the invitation to participate. So I come actually originally from a biomedical research scientist background, and I did that for a number of years. And then I changed direction quite completely. And after many different professions, I ended up working in the space of higher education, learning in health and higher education settings. And how I really got interested in working out how to do things better was a contract that I had when I first went out as a consultant, which was to develop a best practice framework for learning environments in clinical contexts, and so clinical learning environments. And that started about 14 years ago now and has kept me moving inevitably on the path of working out what is the best way for an organization to create a learning environment that's actually conducive to learning, but also to maintain it and to contextualize it in the larger goals of the organization around quality, safety, improvement, and so on.
Thank you, Donna. RJ, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, thank you again for inviting me as well, Nippon. And some of the audience will already know me. My background is aeronautical engineering, have line management experience in production and in engineering. And for the last 10 years or so, I've collaborated with Sidney Dekker and others, Nippon as well, in ensuring that organizations take the next step in proactive safety management. And I'm affiliated with the SDO, University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands.
Thank you, all three of you. Very humbled to have you all. So the topic of discussion is just culture desirable for learning? That's really the question we want to ask. And given the nature of discussion that we've had in the last 3 or 2 episodes in the series, we've heard a lot about the concept of just culture and justice. And we've had very different views on that. I thought it would be wonderful to start with the idea of learning, what learning means, what sort of assumptions we are making when we talk about the term learning, and then see how that relates to the idea of just culture. So would that be a fair start then? And yeah, I'm open whoever wants to talk about the idea of learning first. Yes, Raj, please go ahead.
Learning, and we talked about this in the pre-discussion, and I was going to focus on learning after an incident, which many of the audience will relate to as being quite a necessary step. I mean, after all, you've had an incident, and then it's good to take the costs and all the pain that's involved in the incident and at least turn it somewhat into something positive by learning from it. And what we find often is that there is learning, and we spend a lot of energy in writing a report after the incident investigation, first investigating, of course, the incident, and then writing the report, and more often than not, including recommendations for improvement in that report. But the question I put before you is that really learning? In my perspective, that's only part of it. The recommendations or the insights that are created through the investigation are important, surely. But from that, we then need to plan somehow how to implement the improvements that we have gathered through the insights, and then actually do the implementation as well. And as far as I'm concerned, we don't actually reap the full benefits of the incident. I mean, the positive aspects of the incidents, given all the negativity that it has created, if we don't close the loop and ensure that whatever we thought up beforehand is checked, whether it has been implemented, and even one step further, whether it is as effective as we had thought it might be. And I think the real learning, certainly in many organizations currently, comes from that, because we will find that many of the suggestions that follow from an incident investigation are actually quite superficial. Train this or that person, add some text to a procedure, hang up a new sign, create some new safety clutter. And I'm pretty sure that if we made the effort, we would find that that does not really contribute to a better workplace, and therefore doesn't really constitute learning. I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Yes. So what I'm hearing, RJ, is really the challenge around the idea or the notion of implementation, and implementation in the sense that it actually closes the loop, to use your own word. Yeah. So that's where you see that we are not learning as an organization. Am I right in what I repeated?
Yeah, that's correct. And not just the implementation itself, i.e., hanging up the signs or creating the new procedures, but also checking whether that actually has the effect of mitigating the risk that appeared when we had the incident.
Is there, instead of being abstract, is there value in giving an example, RJ, to help understand this? 'Cause I think it's quite
I,
powerful.
yeah, I think many of the audience will be able to imagine their own examples. The example of hanging up new signs, or creating yet another procedure and not testing their effectiveness is, I think, is ubiquitous. One particular example that we came across was actually one step earlier, in where we were talking to an organization, and they had their weekly safety discussion, and much of it was centered around which actions had not yet been executed. And this was a weekly return on the backlog of safety actions yet to be implemented. And to be honest, this was a catch-22, because once a safety action is on a list, it needs to be executed, one feels. That's why we put it on the list, after all. But really what we see is that in hindsight, not the incident hindsight, but in the moment realization, that these actions might actually not be very effective. So we delay executing them because we don't feel they're very beneficial anyway. And rather than going into discussion and saying, all right, we should take this off the list, that in many organizations is an absolute no-no. And we were there when the discussion was held, and we ventilated the thought that maybe this action wasn't useful at all and we should take it off the list. But no, we couldn't do that, because it followed from an incident report and been put on the list. And so it was going to remain on the list, even if the backlog was multiple years.
Yeah, just to build on that, a lot of times what you see as a corrective action is a very simple statement that this will be followed up in due course, and nobody status, what that really means. So yeah, it's an interesting one. Thank you. Donna, would you like
Yeah.
to offer your thoughts?
Yeah, so I did actually consider the whole question about whether just culture is desirable for learning, and I came to the conclusion that it is desirable, but there are actually two parts to that, which come down to my views on the two key terms of the question. You sort of alluded to this, namely what is just culture and what is learning, and I'll sort of start with learning. So I think the first point I have to make is that learning happens in any setting, any context, or any culture that exists. It can be active learning, it can be passive, it can be formal, informal, ad hoc. But the important thing out of all of this is that learning doesn't always end up on what you might think of as the positive side of the equation. So, like, for example, if you worked in an organization, say, that turned a blind eye to bullying and harassment, in other words, a culture that tolerated that behavior, then what you might learn, depending on your own situation, your own preferences, your own values, is actually how to bully and harass other people. Or if you're the victim of bullying or harassment, then you might learn how to avoid or manage those bullying and harassment situations. Similarly, if you work in an organization that doesn't follow best practice for, whatever the goods are that are produced or the services that are delivered, then you might learn and most likely adopt for yourself the suboptimal practices, which you then in turn pass on to other people. So I think when we use the term learning, I think we have to be very clear about what we mean when we ask that question. Now, when I read the question, I guess I interpreted it with what you would have to describe as unwritten qualifiers, because they're not there in the actual statement itself. And what I felt that the question implied was a concept of learning that underpins improvement. In other words, that drives a positive outcome for the organization. I also listened to your two earlier panels that discussed the question. And what I heard, and it was interesting because Ajay, you sort of said this a little bit earlier, you sort of heard learning as shorthand for learning from errors or mistakes. But there, I think, is the rub. Learning from errors, mistakes, near misses, and so on is not the only kind of learning that could occur. And that's really why I said back at the start that I think just culture is desirable for learning, because just culture, or in fact any kind of culture, is not essential for learning, because people will learn under any circumstances, irrespective of the culture that's in place. So I don't think we can separate what we understand learning to be from what our understanding of, in the context of your question, from what we understand just culture to mean. So when I look at just culture in a healthcare context, which is what I'm most familiar with, the definition I think that is pretty much accepted and used is that there is organizational accountability for the systems that they've designed and employee accountability for the choices that they make. So that's sort of how they define just culture in a healthcare setting. What that says to me is that accountability works in both directions and is a shared responsibility. And I think that's a good starting point for considering what type of culture is most likely to drive positive learning. What that definition doesn't take into account, unfortunately, is that employees are often, not always, but often, their choices are a direct consequence of how the system was designed. So there's actually a gray area in there between what is clearly an organizational responsibility or accountability and what is clearly an employee accountability. The other definition of just culture that is commonly used is, it simply states that a just culture is the opposite of blame culture. Now, the problem that I have with that definition is that it focuses on the conceptualization of just culture on those situations where something has gone demonstrably wrong. And that's because we only use the term blame when there is an outcome that's undesirable or inappropriate or has caused harm in some way. But actually, of the 5 key components of just culture, only one of them, namely learning from mistakes versus blaming individuals, is explicitly focused on how an organization deals with things that go wrong. The other 4 key components, which are adopting a model of shared accountability, managing behavioral choices, designing safety into all your systems and your processes, and a commitment of organizational leaders to shared goals. None of those are focused on how you deal with mistakes, errors, near misses, incidents, and so on. So actually, I think that the two terms, just culture and learning, are intertwined, but not in the way that we typically do that. I think that what just culture is mostly about is unshackling learning from its association with mistakes and errors. If we believe that the only things that we can learn from are those situations that have not turned out well, then actually we're not a learning organization at all. We're just a reactive organization that doesn't encourage reflection by anyone unless things are demonstrably broken. On the other hand, a learning organization is one that learns from routine practice, that sees learning opportunities in everyday activities, including things that go right, which of course in most organizations is well over 90%. A learning organization, I think, is an organization where all levels of management, they don't just tolerate and put up with feedback from their employees, but rather they're actively and proactively seeking it, they're enabling it, they're actually facilitating it. And that's even when things go well. And actually, as I was just saying a moment ago, those things are embodied in the key components of just culture. If we focus on just culture as prescribing our approach to mistakes and errors, we aren't really implementing the whole notion of just culture. And one of the questions, I think it came out of the second panel discussion, was, well, how do we know if an organization has a just culture and is learning? And I think it was Nikolaos who said that learning can be seen to have occurred when things change. So that was his definition of what learning is, that it causes things to change. Now, while I think that things won't change unless some learning has occurred, I don't think it's necessarily the case that learning will always result in change. Sometimes what you learn from reflecting on routine practices is that you should continue doing exactly what you're currently doing, because in other words, actually what you're doing is being done as well as it could be in the current circumstances, and no specific change is needed. So learning is not about changing things. Learning, as I would define it, is about reflecting on our practice to determine whether things need to be changed. And so if we're looking for some indicator that an organization has a just culture in place, I think that we can start by asking whether there are opportunities for reflection on routine practice that take place on a regular basis as part and parcel of business practices of the organization, not separate to them. This week we're doing quality, this week we're doing safety, this week we're doing, focusing on errors. It's not that, it's part of normal business practice. And so coming full circle, this is why I think that just culture is desirable for learning, because just culture, when it's implemented in its fullest meaning of the term, creates the conditions for the broadest possible learning within the organization.
Thank you. That's a really elaborate answer. So, couple of things, Donna, before I go to Nicholas. What I'm hearing is you started off with the idea of the example you gave was, if people are being bullied, they are being harassed, and then that's how the culture of the organization is, then very soon people will find a way to accept that and learn to respond to that. So is that really learning, or is it adapting to the culture of the organization?
I think that it's a little bit splitting hairs to talk about learning as being separate from adapting. I think that you adapt because of what you learn from things. I don't think that adaptation happens without something somewhere in your mind saying, here's what we've observed, and here's what I've decided is going to be my way to deal with what I've observed. And that's learned behavior. So I don't think there's a difference. I think you're right that it does represent an adaptation, but that, if you like, is a change that occurs as a result of learning something. I learned that if I put my hand up and say something, that person over there is going to get annoyed, and this is going to have these repercussions. Therefore, what do I learn? I probably shouldn't speak up. I don't speak up.
Yes, and this is the idea of what you call single loop learning,
Mm,
and single loop learning is how we are trained, how we are schooled, how we are educated for our lives. But I'll come to that. It's interesting that is, and this is one way of understanding learning. The other thing I wanted to ask you was the idea around opportunities for reflection.
mm,
Now, how would you tangibly explain what that means in a concrete sense? How would
mm.
there are lots of meetings that happen in an organization
Oh yeah, yeah.
after an incident. What would you see as an opportunity for reflection?
Mm. So I've actually done this in practice in a healthcare organization. Um, and we use the framework for the conversations that were had regularly once a week for about 40 minutes once a week. We use the framework was the national standards for safety and quality in health service settings, the NSQHS standards that are here in Australia. Most countries have some kind of a standard around hospitals and health services are meant to perform. So we use that as the framework, and we use that to provide structure to weekly conversations about how everyday practice was happening. So the starting point was not, oh dear, Mrs. Smith had the wrong leg amputated. That wasn't the starting point for the conversation. The starting point for the conversation was, oh, look, it is Monday afternoon at 2 p.m. It's time for us to sit down and talk about what we're doing in a tangible sense. So you have to plan the time to do it, because otherwise the busyness of work will get in the way. You want to bring groups into the conversation. It's not just about individuals reflecting. Of course, that's part of it, but team-based reflection in team working environments is so much more valuable. And it has to have a structure to it, because otherwise things just go off in all sorts of directions and you don't necessarily get to explore all of the things that you need to explore. And then directly linking those conversations into what RJ was talking about, an action plan for implementing what you think are going to be the fixes for any problems that you've identified. But very importantly, that action plan should also build on the positive learning. So if you are reviewing general practice and you think that this is going really well, this particular aspect of routine practice, what can we learn from that we could implement in other aspects of our business processes that aren't working so well? So it's about taking both the things that look like they could be problems that will manifest themselves down the line, and also things that look like they're going perfectly well, nothing to see here, folks, but you can still learn positive things from that and then implement the consequences, the readout of that.
Have you finished, or do you want to say more?
Oh, no. I've talked enough.
So,
Next person.
so uh, yes, this is interesting because once again one could argue that there are meetings held after an incident, after accident, normal meetings held in the offices where we have opportunities for reflection, we have action plans. There's good things come out from them and go back into the safety management system. So um, apart from the structure, what components do you see in that opportunity for reflection in that format? That what does that really mean? As maybe an example would help, Donna.
Okay, so in a hospital context, when we were doing one of these conversations, we were talking about a process in health services that's called clinical handover. So this is where one practitioner who has been looking after a patient hands over to the next one who's just coming on to the floor. And this process is often where mistakes happen, because the person who was on the floor knows what's happened over the last 8 hours. But if they don't pass on that information properly to the person taking over, then you can have the wrong medication, the wrong dose, things not done, things done that shouldn't be, and so on. And because they were talking about it just from the point of view of how well do you think this is doing, not why did Mrs. Smith get the wrong dose of medication, nobody in the room felt that anybody was looking to blame anybody for anything. They were all just simply looking to explore. And by encouraging everybody in the room to speak up and talk about how they actually see those things working from their perspective, people are now open to hearing other ideas and things that people are saying. So in this particular case, what they identified was that the nurses in the emergency department, who are the primary caregivers for the patients, and every so often a doctor comes along, there were a lot of missteps happening between the nurse and the doctor. And they said, well, what could we do to fix this? And they said, why don't we just put some whiteboards up in the cubicles and have a section there that is specifically for the attention of the doctor? So they said, well, why don't we trial it? So they did. It's a 35-bed emergency department, and they put them up in 10 of the units, and they trialed it for a period of a couple of months. It made an enormous difference. And so you could call that a superficial change, but actually it turned out not to be a superficial change. More importantly, the idea came from the people who actually experiencing the difficulty in the issue. So they felt ownership over issue diagnosis. They felt ownership over identifying potential solutions, and therefore they were more likely to implement them. One of the things that often blocks implementation of good ideas is people go, well, how would that person know? They just came in here for 10 minutes and had a quick look around, and then they wrote their recommendations. Nobody asked me what I think. And so you'll find that resistance that occurs to implementing change or even contemplating change because the individuals who have to make use of the changes were never consulted about whether that was the real problem or what they thought the solution might be. So in answer to your question, Nippin, it's about having structure. It's about encouraging everybody in the room to have a say. It's about making the topic of conversation not something where anybody could even feel remotely that they're at fault or to blame, because it doesn't matter. You can write whatever you want. This is a just no blame culture situation. When things go wrong, people will go, oh, what did I do? Is that my fault? But because that was not the starting point for the conversation, they were able to just simply talk about what was going on and then give them ownership over the implementation of that solution as well. So those, I think, that's what I think you can do by engaging your frontline workforce in the whole process of reflection.
Great. I'm glad I asked the question. So many good things came out of it, Donna. I'm hearing, if I'm hearing it right, I love the term Peter Senge uses. It's called reflective conversations, and I think this is what you're referring to. But also talking about the interdependencies that exist across the organization, across departments, across hierarchies, which only become visible, which only surface when you create the space for people to come and have those open discussions, or not discussions, I would use the word dialogue. And I think these conversations are very, very difficult to achieve in practice, as you and I both know. That's great. It's a good start. Thank you. And that's what you refer to as learning, if I'm not wrong, the idea of reflective conversations.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Donna. We'll go to Nikos now. And Nikos, you bring us back to the deck of the ship now, which is where you are, or the bridge of the ship. And help us understand what learning means in your world.
That's a great question, and it has also been a great discussion up to now. As I mentioned before, I started even before I officially became an adult at the age of 17 to go at sea. I'm now 46. This is the main job I've been doing my whole life. And I started from the lowest of the ranks, climbing up all the way until master's position, which is the most responsible position. This ladder that I had to climb up was essential and was really beneficial for my official involvement, if I can say so, development as a professional. Because I took it from the lowest of the ranks, see how it really happens, how the smallest of and the easiest jobs are being done until the more difficult ones. And all this has been a learning procedure. The interesting things, I think that I still see and see most vividly nowadays is that I'm still learning. And actually this is something that personally I love to do. So learning is a procedure that is, when you are getting to a level of success in your job, it's really normal that you become confident, because the experience that you have gained and the interaction with yourself, your internal discussion, gives you the power and the confidence to move on and to take sometimes risks. You should do that, of course, carefully and in a controllable manner, but you have to, because life has risks, and especially at sea, risk, you cannot avoid it. All in all, that confidence can lead you sometimes to be reluctant or to be overconfident, while you shouldn't. But learning has to be something that, in the context we're working at, and personally with ourselves, something that we should remind to ourselves, to become part of our nature. If that stops, one colleague of mine told me, I believe that up to when you are 35, you can continue learning, you can continue reading, then you cannot. It makes some sense, but I am against it. So learning is something that is ongoing. Now, how do you learn? That's another issue. Maybe, to me, the most important of all. It's not experience, but I will add here a quote that I read when I was young on a book, that experience is not what happens to us, it is what we learn from what happens to us. So I have seen a lot of colleagues that have had a lot of incidents, either good or bad, negative or positive, and they never diluted it, they never went and reflected back to it to find out what happens, what happened, why. From my end, I after everything that is ongoing, I make my own evaluation myself. Yeah, and I say, okay, this went well. Why did it go well? Dilute it a bit. Try to search it, to break it in bits and bytes, and see where did you do right, what could be done better, what could be done wrong. Of course, the same happens when things go wrong. But if you follow that mindset, definitely it will make you better and better. The other thing is the context we're living at. And maybe us in the medical or in the aviation industries, I am in a job that the blame is straightforward and has severe consequences. Because if I make a mistake and it's vital, maybe once I will get off it. If I'm lucky, I will get it in the second, the third, I'm done. And being done means I'm losing my job, that I'm losing my financial security, my independence, my name, my reputation is destroyed. So there is a fear behind that pushes you back to be all the time, apart from your responsibility, that and how serious you are in the job you do, you haven't the consequences. So how do we learn? And there is something unfair that happens, at least in my industry. There are things going on. Ships are systems. Actually, many subsystems work in higher systems, in bigger systems, in bigger. So, and they're working, they're alive. There are a lot of humans that are working. There is a lot of technology. There is a lot of interference with the environment, a lot of legislation, many things that are being blended up. And all in all, things are going well. Ships are not sinking every day. Ships are not exploding every day. It's not the majority of ships that are going wrong every day. All throughout all those years that I am at sea, nobody ever came and told me, hey, let's see, what did you do right? Not yourself, your team, but everybody. What did you do right today? How this ongoing thing goes well? Why is it? To make the research and the investigation like you would do after an incident, after something, after an accident. We only focus on the near misses or the accidents when things go wrong. Okay, and if I have done, let's say, 5, 10 things really well, and one wrong, why do we focus on the one that is wrong and we don't try to see how did all those things have been going well all that time? Of course, we have to investigate and find out what went wrong, don't get me wrong, but why we don't try to see what we're doing right, because apparently we do, otherwise the industry wouldn't work, and learn from that as well. Because the most of the times it is the same person that makes 10 things right and 1 wrong. And we go back to blame culture, we judge people, we cut off heads, we make scapegoating. I believe not to learn, definitely. This is not to learn. It's just for the system to work, for the insurances to have somebody to blame, for the system just, it's like politics, that somebody has to be blamed, so everybody, that seems justice. This is not justice. Of course, at all, is not justice. Learning, on the other hand, to be fair, nowadays has to do with a lot of theoretical and technical knowledge that we didn't have access before. New technologies comes, new ingredients, new materials, new mindsets, new theories. They're coming all the time because we're living in a world that is progressing. Yeah. So we have to learn and we have to get that feedback. We have to do that proactively. If we do that, if we do have that knowledge proactively, for sure, this will avert mishaps, for sure. But we have to have that in advance. We have to be open to that and to learn and try to avoid mistakes. Mistakes, on the other hand, are human nature. We cannot avoid mistakes. I'm really sorry. I would love to be God and don't make mistakes, but I'm not. I'm just a human. I guess everybody here in that room is. So we try to judge people sometimes badly, strictly, forgetting their human nature and forgetting that the same persons have made it right so many times. Why don't we try to learn? One last thing from my end is that whenever I go to a new ship, because I truly love safety, I love to work with it, and I don't, as I told you the other time, I don't want to become a case study, even though it matters too. So I say, guys, come everybody here, officers, ranks, ratings, everybody. What is safety to your eyes? And they tell me to make drills, to follow the protocols. Okay. That's the obvious one. What is deeper safety? To me, deeper safety, there are two things, to my eyes. The one is hardware, the other is software. The hardware is the equipment that we have. The ship is designed under some very certain rules. We have to make sure that the hardware works. And it all goes fine, so we have weapons to fight. The other one is the software, is us, is humans. If we are not trained properly, if we don't have knowledge, if we don't get to communicate better, if we are not prepared, if there is no preparedness, you cannot have, it doesn't matter if you have the most high-tech thing, you will not be able to use it. So if those things at least add together at a basic point, then we can make a start. If we don't have that, how else can we do? And then the next thing that has to do with humans is proactivity. And proactivity is when things go right, try to check what goes right, make it a good practice. If you see something that is wrong, report it in advance. Try to discuss it openly. Don't be afraid. Before it's too late. When it's too late, what's the meaning? You see a naked cable coming out from the roof and it's 220 volts there. This is apparently danger. You have to be proactive with that. Report it. Try to avoid it. Try to make, as I say, a sort of not investigation, a sort of like you're making inspection your own ship, like somebody with fresh eyes will come on board and check. So that thing will give us.
Yes, thank you.
That thing will save us. Thanks.
Yes. I think there's a lot in what you said. I just want to capture the key issues. I think there's two main issues that, as I'm hearing at the moment. I think the first one you started off was very, very powerful, and I would love to get a little bit more insight from you on that. But I think you talk about the idea of learning as something which is very individual, which is something very personal, and I find it very interesting when you talk about the idea of how the more experience you gain, the more confident you become, and the more difficult it gets for you to learn something. I found that very, very powerful. The other thing is that the excessive focus on what goes wrong, which creates a culture of blaming individual and an unfair culture as a whole. This is what I'm hearing so far. And what you're saying is, can we be a little bit more proactive in the way we approach learning? Am I right in capturing the key message? Okay,
sure,
great.
Sure.
Okay, so we've had a few different takes on learning. I'm just trying to scratch my head here. It's one is I think RJ's idea of very much rooted in the idea of PDCA, which is plan, do, check, and act. I think that's what you're referring to, RJ. Deming's kind of work. And if it's done in the spirits of PDCA, then we can achieve a lot more learning than we do, which presently doesn't happen. And the funny thing is, we all think it does. That's interesting. And then we come to Donna, who has a more grassroots perspective on learning, which is learning from the bottoms up, but also learning as across departments, across hierarchies, trying to understand system interdependencies and encouraging people to speak, because in those words is both the information and the exformation, which is what is said, what is not said, and those things become visible. and you get a lot more collaboration and trust across the organization. And then we come to Nikos, who is very much rooted in the idea of um, learning as something that should happen more proactively. And at the moment, it's far from what happens on the ground. What I would like to now do is to take the discussion to the next level, which is maybe we can start with RJ. RJ, how do you think we can achieve this kind of thinking through just culture? What's your view on that? Or is there a connection between the two?
Yeah, absolutely, Nippin. As Nikos and Donna already suggested, learning requires an environment in which there's acceptance of human variability, and acknowledgement that systems and rules and the rest of the context create outcomes that are most often very wanted, but sometimes do not. And then we also need to relate to the times that we're successful, that the outcomes are as desired, to properly understand what is happening and to take the next step forward. And so what we're really saying is that this, not the learning itself, the instrumental act of taking a particular instance and finding out what we should be technically or otherwise solving, that's not really the issue. The issue is to create an environment within the organization in which we can do that continuously and productively. And so much of the challenge that I'm currently working in organizations about is how to create that environment. And it goes without saying that if we drive errors and ways and the real way that work is done, if we drive that underground, if we do not make that transparent, then it's very, very difficult for the organization as a whole to take lessons from that, to improve on it, to check it for new risks that are being introduced, or to use it as a best practice elsewhere. And so the environment must be one of curiosity rather than normative approach to how work is actually being done. Now, that is a gigantic step for many, many organizations and for managers in it. And to be honest, that's not weird. That's not their personal disadvantage or something which they from their personality have created. That's the way that over the last couple of decades we have educated managers and employees alike. Here are the rules, go and adhere to them. These are the procedures, this is what to do. If at all we have a change, read it, sign for it, apply it. And what we do in investigation reports more often than not is these were the rules, this is where the non-compliance, or even better, the violation was, therefore that is what went wrong. But that's not reality in today's complex world. In today's complex world, we need to understand how work is done, and from that, understand what the rules and procedures were used as a resource and not as a binding legal entity. Of course, there are laws that we need to adhere to, but 80% of the rules that are valid in organizations are self-made. And many of the rules in Western world, at least, are much more goal rules rather than procedural rules. So the way that we do work and the way that we describe working rules and procedures is very much part of our own liberty, our own freedom of choice. And we need to now understand that there can be, through goal conflicts, some challenges between what we do in practice and how we think it's done, and understand those gaps to then improve on work itself. We've termed that local ingenuity. That's a new term, local ingenuity. And the term describes, on the one hand, that it's very decentral, therefore local, very, very much in a place outside of what is usually seen. And we name it ingenuity on purpose to frame its smartness, the solution-driven approach that people take to work to manage the different goals that they have to achieve. And mind you, those goals are partly tangible and described, but partly very much intangible, informal, not described, conveyed socially. That doesn't make them social goals, but conveyed socially. What about finishing this before the next shift? How about we can do this with 2 people rather than 1, so that the other way around, why 1 people rather than 2, so that we have free up someone for important work elsewhere, that sort of thing. Does that answer your question or pose even more? Donna wants to
Yeah,
react.
I think it poses many more questions, but I'll have to limit myself. But I still ask one follow-up question to that. First of all, I would like to get my understanding right. I think what you're talking about is to make variability in everyday work, institutionalize it to the organizational level, that it's okay to have variability because that's how work is actually done. So you want to create this language, or the language already exists. You want to make this language heard to the senior management. The thing that I
Correct.
find interesting about local ingenuity is that there is a much simpler word we use in the maritime world. It's called seamanship. Um, and, and we,
Professionalism. Yeah,
yes,
yeah, yeah.
and that's interesting. So I'm
No, no, but
giving.
that's not the same. That's not the same, Nippin. I
Right. So,
protest you.
but hang on, because the concrete example might help here, Ajay. So many years ago, I was visiting a ship in Aberdeen, and the ship had come from tropical waters in Africa, and she was detained first thing when she came to Aberdeen. And what was found on the ship was that somebody had drilled a hole under the lifeboat, and the reason for drilling that hole was, crazy as it may sound to many people, that who goes and drills holes in the lifeboat? The idea was that ship came from tropical waters where she was experiencing a lot of rain, and water would get trapped in the boat. And there were two solutions. One was to replace the bilge pump, which was faulty. The other one was to do something more creative, and drill a hole and then plug it so nothing goes wrong. And you can drain the water and you can plug it back, and that's your problem solved. Now, that issue had been raised many times to the management. It had been overlooked, and why? Because it was not a commercial problem, because the bilge pump doesn't cost more than $100. I think what I'm trying to allude towards is that it is, in an organization, it is very difficult for people to, or not just in an organization, in real sense, when you talk about curiosity, there is no space for curiosity in most organizations.
Yeah.
Ah,
It is very difficult to make people curious, and I don't think it's a result of 20 years of
no.
proceduralization. I think it's very much human nature, and I'd like to tie it back to Nico's point that essentially we are talking to people who are between 30 and 50 years old when we are speaking this language. And this is a very interesting demographic, because this is a stage where you have learned a lot of experience and you can't let go of what you know. I think there is, in my view at least, this is a big hindrance to learning, but I'm open to your comments on this.
You're addressing me. Can I just react
Yeah,
to
yeah,
what
yeah.
you said? Yeah.
Please.
So the example you gave was an excellent example of local ingenuity, and what you would want as a more senior manager is to first of all know that this happened, not only when it came back to Scotland or wherever it was, but also at the moment it was happening. And you would want to just consider which additional risks were being introduced by drilling the hole and plugging it with a cork. So that shows that local ingenuity must become transparent for it to be embedded within the organization. But it's an excellent example of what you bring. I protest against the word seamanship, or its synonym professionalism. And the reason is that has been misused by many traditional safety and managers, safety addicts and managers, in the sense that you are seaman-like or you are professional if only you abide by the rules. And I've actually seen a video where accidents were only explained in terms of he was not professional because he did not follow the rules. And given my earlier explanation, I can't abide by that. So I prefer local ingenuity to that sort of more
Oh, yes, yes.
mystical
Yeah.
terms. Yep.
I agree. I totally agree. It can be the beauty of the word seamanship, but it can fit anywhere at all. But Donna wants to say something.
Yeah, well, first of all, just to the example that you gave there, Nippin, it's interesting to think that if they had asked everybody who is in the situation of what they thought a solution might be, someone might have come up with a solution of storing the lifeboats upside down so that water couldn't collect in them. And then when they're needed, the first thing that happens is they flip over so that they can be deployed right way up. But anyway, that was just came out of what you had just offered there as an example. I think that there are two reasons why organizations don't do more of this. And the first is that everything now is about money and spending as little on it as you possibly can. And so that means that an activity that is spent doing something that isn't necessary, we don't have a problem here. Why do we need to spend time talking about it? They say, well, we'll have to trim that whole activity out so that we can afford to just run our organization. This is certainly true in healthcare. But the second, and I actually think more important reason why senior managers don't like to consult with the rest of the workforce on a regular basis is for exactly the same reason that the blame culture impacts on employees, is that if you turn it around and the employees say, well, that decision that you made that I have to do X, Y, and Z doesn't work for me, managers feel that they're being blamed. And so what we need to do is to find a way to enable a dialogue, a productive dialogue between senior executives, middle managers, frontline teams about what's actually going on so that the senior people can understand why the frontline people are doing what they're doing or asking for what they're asking. And in exactly the same way, the frontline people can understand why it is that the people at the top of the organization said, I want you to do this instead of do that. It's not necessarily going to mean that everyone walks away feeling entirely comfortable about the solutions that are decided upon, but at least they understand the reasons for it and are more likely to be supportive of each other's positions through that level of understanding. So if we're going to change this and we're going to go for really just cultures, and we're serious about that, we have to make sure that we don't turn this into a way of blaming the people at the top of the organization any more than we were blaming the people at the bottom.
I can't agree more. And this is precisely one of the big problems with systems thinking, at least in the way it's understood today, that it has to be somebody who has to be blamed. So in my example, if it's not the seaman who drilled the hole, then it must be the guy who did not approve the purchase of the equipment. And I think you're right. There's something really important there. I'm just conscious of the time. Nikos, would you like to say something in closing before we conclude this discussion?
I would like to thank both of my colleagues here. They said it perfectly. I will follow up and take it further. It's a lack of trust. When there is no trust between the teams, then what comes? It comes the hierarchy. The one that is on top will blame the other ones down. So he's out. Come on, we're not living in an angel's world. We know how ethics work. We know how things are being done. So sometimes the management is blind, is abrupt, is deaf, doesn't want to listen, doesn't want to see. And then it's very easy to blame the ones beneath and underneath. The other thing that I want to follow up on what we all said and I said before is the share of knowledge proactively will definitely assist. What I'm doing with my teams, every day that when things go right or when, everyday operations, we share the knowledge. We plan in advance and then we can make a follow-up. But this has to be useful, not according to a protocol. And first of all, the one that is on top has to have the responsibility and I don't know how to say it politely, to be exposed and say, listen, guys, this is first of all, I will speak first, yeah? I'm a captain. Today I maneuvered. This was my mistake today. First, me. Then the others will have the courage to come and say, yes, captain, but I did that and we did the other. So we then can proactively work and see that things will not get right. If we don't do that, if I am cutting the people under me to give me feedback, then I'm deaf as well. And then the same will happen with me and the company, that I will try to relay a message and the same thing happens. So, yeah, I think we understand all each other quite well here. Yeah? Thanks.
Sometimes we do worse, which is we expect an apology, and that closes the discussion. That's even more powerful. But that's a great point. Yes, sir. So we are almost at the end of the session. What I would like to do is to just go around the room and just ask everyone to just sum up their thoughts about um, about the question: is just culture desirable for learning? And just please don't take more than 2 minutes, because that would mean you take somebody else's time. Uh, Donna, would you like to give it a go? You're muted, Donna.
I'll try speaking without muting. I was going to do sign language, but I think that a just culture is desirable when just culture is understood in its fullest meaning, not simply restricted to how we address things that go wrong. I think it is desirable, and I think it's desirable because it can't be essential, because the reality is that people will learn no matter what the circumstances and what the culture are. So what people learn and how people learn and how productive that is for an organization entirely depends upon the environment that we create for that learning to take place. And if just culture is implemented as I believe the full definition of just culture was intended to be, then I think that you can have the organizational learnings that you need in order to improve as an organization, make yourselves a good place to work, and a good deliverer of services or products to your clients or consumers.
Thank you, Donna. Very helpful. RJ, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I absolutely concur with what Donna just said. And so the challenge is how do we go about creating an environment of justness or restorativeness, if you want? How do we ensure that the management, but also the employees, that at all levels of the organization, are moving towards this way of interacting with each other? And that is still challenge. I find it challenging when I work with organizations. We're making progress, but probably not as quick as I or the organizations themselves would want. So I think that's worthy of the next thoughts, next step in thinking out. Thank you.
Thank you, RJ. Nikos, would you like to say something before we close?
Yeah, I would like, following up to everybody, first of all, that responsibility should be according to the rank. The higher the rank, the higher the responsibility, and the responsibility not to blame, but to be proactive, to foresee something going wrong and put the measures in advance so it doesn't happen. And this starts from the top, from the CEO, and then it goes down. The higher you are, the more responsibility you have. The other thing that for just culture to exist and to succeed and to strive is to be open, to be true, just a sort of justice that is being felt everywhere around is a true just culture. And the other one is that we share it all, the successes and the failures. If we share it all between us fairly, this is a true just culture that will succeed. If not, if it's only one-sided, it will not. That's how I see it. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, and thank you to those who are listening. This is the end of the session, and I would like to end the broadcast here. Thank you for everyone who joined us.